Hello, everybody, and welcome. The following is a discussion that was recorded from a men's meeting in Arizona on January 5th, 2024. This meeting is a men's meeting of the Loving Parent Guidebook, and the purpose basically of inviting me to speak was they're looking at trying to define a format for their meeting, and the meeting is primarily geared towards introducing men from the Alcoholics Anonymous Fellowship into the ACA Fellowship to help them on their path of recovery and serenity. I was invited to speak as a therapist because of my background dealing with patients with trauma who are also in recovery from alcohol and other substances. Yeah, my views here, a little disclaimer, are not necessarily reflective of my employers, but this is how I work my practice within my job. The recording wasn't initiated when I started talking, so I would like to just fill in a little bit of what I talked about prior to the beginning of the recording session. One of the reasons why I refer almost all of my patients who are coming in for recovery of substance use disorders, from alcohol to marijuana to meth to heroin, referring them to ACA is because at the root of a lot of people, at their pain and their use, is trauma. Kaiser Permanente HMO hospital group a few years ago put out a study trying to find out why people get sick, and the answers they got really surprised them. And a huge percentage of people, somewhere around like 90% or something, of people that end up in the hospital had what they called adverse childhood experiences. And this prompted a study, which they used the acronym ACE. And this ACE study looked and defined different types of adverse childhood experiences. And the more of these experiences that a person has experienced in their life, the more likely they are to develop substance use problems or bad health problems. And now moving forward, understanding that trauma is the basis of why most people turn to poor coping skills, including substance use, let's look at how the Loving Parent Guidebook within the ACA Fellowship can be beneficial for people coming in from AA and other fellowships. And now let's get into the recording.
And there was a committee, I think it was like 2017, that got together and said, if the purpose of ACA is to become your own loving parent, why do we not have a specific text on how to become our own loving parent? Hence, we got the Loving Parent Guidebook. I believe, as the intent of AA is to not drink and have serenity, I believe that the intent of ACA is to become your own loving parent so that the laundry list traits that you identify with can be extinguished. I really think that the goal is to be able to look at the laundry list, and instead of identifying with all those 14 traits, to be able to look at it and say, okay, I used to do this. I used to fall into that trap. That used to be me, but today I don't need to do that any longer. And to get to that place and extinguish those behaviors, there's a couple different ways to get there. Certainly working the steps is one of them. I see the Loving Parent Guidebook as not necessarily step work. I see it as pure therapy. And what the committee has done, and reading it, I can tell that this was written by therapists. They've taken a lot of outstanding therapies like DBT, which is dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, transactional analysis, interfamily systems therapy, and they've combined all of those to come up with the Loving Parent Guidebook, and then have rebranded the different terminology to fit the ACA language. I just want to make sure that people, as they dive into ACA, that they don't automatically necessarily dive into the Loving Parent Guidebook without understanding kind of the concepts of the 12 steps too. I actually think that the Loving Parent Guidebook is really getting in depth and working like at a super in depth step 6 and 7. Really getting into what are the character defects, because the character defects are the dysfunction of our inner family, right? One of my pet peeves is I think the steps should have been linked, connected more with the Loving Parent Guide, because there's a lot of things in here, the exercises that really do kind of mirror step work, and for them to be integrated more in with the steps, I think helps people to understand the steps as well, so that people don't just come in and jump in and do Loving Parent Guidebook and forget about the importance of the steps and the benefits of working the 12 steps as well. The other thing about therapy, let me kind of pull some notes up here. And this is a difference between AA and ACA. AA was, developed in the 1930s, and there's some medical terminology and studies that were packed into that. But now we are, almost 100 years advanced from there, and ACA is using a lot more evidence-based approach. And one of the things that we know now that we did not know back in the 1930s was about neuroplasticity and neuro reprocessing. And basically, in a nutshell, and this is kind of what a lot of the new therapies are going through, if anybody has heard of EMDR. Basically, if you think of your computer has a hard drive and it has RAM. And your brain is similar with that. And if you have a nice memory as a child, where let's say you have a birthday party and you have a nice cupcake and it's tasty and you have friends around you, you store that in one specific part of your brain. That's a good memory. But let's say you're having a birthday party and you have a father who comes home and is enraged and throws the cake against the wall and everybody runs out screaming. That's trauma. And as a child, you record that in a different part of your brain. And it's almost like the cake part goes in the hard drive, but the part that is the trauma, this is something that's important. Your brain wants you to remember, this is important. If you see somebody who's rageful, if you see somebody who's loud, whatever the events of this trauma are, it's recorded in a different part of the brain. And it's more like the RAM. So your RAM is always what you're looking at your screen. So it's kind of the filter that things are going through. So what we're learning with neural reprocessing is the traumatic memories that are stored are what triggers the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. How are we still bound to those responses when maybe we've had a wonderful life for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but somehow we are still triggered by certain things? And the ultimate trauma and the ultimate trigger, and why I see a lot of people relapsing to substances or old behavior, is there are triggers that trigger the abandonment response. Whether it be rejection, getting passed over for a job, feeling like you didn't get the Christmas present you wanted, or somebody else got a better Christmas present than you, or somebody gets more attention than you. These are all factors of abandonment. And if this is stored in this part of the brain, we need to be able to move this through neural reprocessing to the hard drive. And that's what EMDR therapy does. And that's something that the Loving Parent Guidebook, I think, really does help prime and do a little bit of work. But I think if somebody is dealing with some really, really deep trauma work, that to do some neural reprocessing with a therapist in addition to using the Loving Parent Guidebook. If you're using the Loving Parent Guidebook, and if you've gone through it once or twice and you're still really finding you have a lot of trauma responses, then I would suggest seeking out a therapist who does EMDR therapy. I do not do EMDR therapy. In my practice, my favorite thing to do is group therapy. And one of the things that I've been doing for about the last 30 years is psychodrama. And psychodrama is another way of doing neural reprocessing, only it takes a little bit of a different approach. It's more of a group dynamic. It has to be extremely spontaneous. And the cool thing about it is when it's done, not just the person doing the work benefits, but it's something that other people can piggyback onto, and there can be a lot of healing out of the group situation. Back to Loving Parent Guidebook. So one of the reasons why I like people to start with Appendix D is if you read the first 9 chapters of the workbook, they ask you to identify your feelings. In this situation, how did you feel? In this situation, what did you think about this? Were there any distortions? Which is chapter 11. So instead of struggling to identify what your feelings are and your distortions, why not start there? Why not start with chapter 10 and actually get into that place where you can understand the feelings? Because in our society, we are trained to not feel. We are trained to be okay and fine. And it's amazing when I'm in group and I'm asking people to check in with their emotions and somebody tells me they're okay. And I keep saying, well, how do you experience okay? What is okay like for you? And they start to get frustrated because they're just their brain and their heart just aren't connected. They just don't understand what their feelings are. And they get upset and they start screaming at me, I'm okay, I'm okay. And as they're screaming at me, I have to show them, no, you are now angry. Everyone else can see it, but they have a difficult time seeing it because we are just trained not to understand our emotions. And the Big Red Book talks about the 3 rules: don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. And the way I look at it, I rearrange the order. It's don't talk, don't feel, don't trust. Because I really think as children, we want to have a voice. And when we try to voice our opinion and we're brushed aside because we're children, or, mom's on the phone, you're interrupting, dad's passed out on the couch, whatever reason, you lose your sense of voice. The feeling comes second, because when we are wanting to express ourselves emotionally, we are shut down. We are told, we don't care how you feel. If you're going to keep crying, we will give you something to cry about. And you learn from those messages to shut down your feelings. And our parents, who are our primary caregivers, at a very, very young age, are our link to the world. And when our link to the world is not there to hear us and is not there to validate our feelings and experiences, that's how we learn not to trust. Because in our schema, they are the ones that we can't trust. And we can't trust them, who or what can we trust? Okay, so that's, I think, where we get off course. I like the cognitive tool called a cognitive reframe, which is saying a negative thought and then talking back to it with a positive spin. If you remember the cartoons with the devil sitting on one shoulder and the angel on another shoulder, devil could say, gee, that drink looks nice. And then the angel says, yes, keep walking away. It's not for you. Okay. That's a reframe in the moment. And I use that tool all the time. I use it mostly when I'm on vacations, and I always have the best vacations despite things going wrong, because no matter what happens, I reframe. And I must do probably 20 reframes like that a day, but it works once it clicks. And it's frustrating because sometimes people overthink it and they get mad at me. It's like, Ken, yesterday I thought I was going to have a bad day, and the positive spin was it wasn't a bad day. And I tell them that's not a reframe, which I don't want to sound like a critical parent. You did it wrong. That is not a reframe. Don't want to come across that way. But the reality is I want people to learn the tool because it works. And there's a difference between saying, I thought today was going to be horrible and I stressed out all day and it turns out it wasn't horrible, which is the positive outcome, not a positive spin on a negative thought. In that moment, when you first have that thought, today is going to suck, the positive spin would be, you know what? Maybe it won't suck.
Maybe I can see people that I really care about today. Maybe I can enjoy holding my children.
That's what a reframe is. And with the Loving Parent Guidebook, I would like to even bring it one step farther. Part of the parts, or I like to call them ego states, of the Loving Parent Guidebook, and I didn't make a picture. Make a picture real quick. I think that there's a part that's missing to the Loving Parent Guidebook if you look at other literature. And I'll draw you the picture that I put on the board with my patients. So we all know about the inner child. We all know about the inner teenager. We all know about the critical parent. And we're all here to become our own loving parent. So the part that's missing in the Loving Parent Guidebook that is in a lot of the other therapies, especially transactional analysis, is the inner adult. And I look at the inner adult different than the critical and the loving parents. There can be a lot of overlap. But I think the adult is just straightforward, very logical, not emotional. And when we do a reframe and we say something like, wow, I screwed up today. And the positive spin is, well, you have tomorrow to do a do-over. Okay. That's a logical response coming from the inner adult. This is the picture that I use if you guys can see this. So I just draw like a big plump stick figure on the board. I call it the pill man. And has the different parts, and then the inner adult that just kind of takes care of business. In doing a loving parent reframe, I add a second reframe to it. And the second reframe is coming from the nurturing parent. So the negative thought, which could be critical parent, could be the teenager, I really screwed up today. Positive spin, which is from the adult, which is you have tomorrow to do better. What if we added the third nurturing parent response, which is just because you screwed up doesn't make you any less of a person. You're still a wonderful person. And it's wonderful that you can identify that you are struggling and tomorrow you're going to give it 100%. Okay. So you see the difference between adding that reframe. Because I know that we had talked about starting a meeting with a check-in, which would be like a 30-second share, which is when the meeting starts. To ground yourself, everybody just checks in with, hi, my name's Ken and I'm feeling X, Y, and Z. And that's it. No explaining why the feelings, but just a way to ground yourself. And it also lets everybody else know kind of what the overall feel and mood in the meeting is from starting by being around that. Anyway, I think those are kind of the main points that I wanted to bring up. So with that said, let's move into questions.
I removed the recording of the Q&A for confidentiality and anonymity purposes, but the big question that came up with talking about the check-in with the emotions at the beginning of the meeting was possibly ending the meeting with a similar check-out, being able to identify if there was any change in a person's emotions during the course of the meeting. And my suggestion with that, and it's a great idea, but my suggestion with that is if you're going to do that, to quantify is to qualify the emotions. So at the beginning of the meeting, if you check in and you're depressed, well, are you 50% depressed? Are you 70% depressed? Now, this is a scale that is individual and only the individual can, rate themselves. But at the end of the meeting, are they still at the same level? I started with 50% depressed, but at the end of the meeting, maybe I'm only 20% depressed and 10% hopeful. So using both a check-in and a check-out at the meeting and using a percentage to qualify the amount of the emotion and to show if there was any improvement in it.